Hello, and welcome to a new edition of H.E.L Explains with your host, Dr. Mario Torres Rodrigo. And today we're going to talk all about gut microbiome and diet. We know that our organism is inhabited by a myriad of microorganisms. We are talking about trillions of them, including bacteria, archaea, fungi, but our gut microbiome is the most abundant of these microbiomes. So, in terms of the key players on the gut microbiome, there are two phyla, two groups that seem to be the dominant. We have, on the one hand, Firmicutes, which are gram-positive and includes facultative or strict anaerobes, so organisms that can survive in the absence of oxygen. And one of the most abundant microorganisms of this phylum is Clostridia. Bacteroidetes, on the other hand, are gram-negative, and they include organisms such as Prevotella that has been linked to healthy microbiomes. But it doesn't end there. There are other organisms that also play very important roles, such as actinobacteria, proteobacteria, or fusobacteria. But the key question here is, what are these microorganisms feeding on? Well, the answer is whatever is left over from the food that we have ingested. Our organism cannot process everything. So it's just going to get down to our gastrointestinal tract, and then it will reach these microorganisms. That they have incredible capacities to break down these unprocessed nutrients. So for example, one of the most common ones is indigestible fiber, and these microorganisms are going to be able to just get these complex chains of sugars and break them down, generating short fatty acids. And these short fatty acids can act as an energy source, for example, for the epithelial cells in our colon. So they are going to have a positive impact in our cells. And this is just one of the activities that they can affect, but they can modulate a plethora of different activities in our bodies. So for example, they can control the permeability of the cells in our colon, or for example, inflammation, and they have been linked to a huge variety of potential health conditions. Some of them are quite self-explanatory, such as things that affect the bowel, such as irritable bowel disorder, IBS, or inflammatory bowel disease, IBD. But also, there are some others that are a bit more tenuous, such as, for example, atopic dermatitis and psoriasis. And even neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. We know that the microbial community can be shaped by the nutrients that this community is going to receive. So, for example, macronutrients, which are the bigger components of the food that the body requires in large quantities in order to function, are going to also affect these communities. And among the macronutrients, we have things such as carbohydrates, we have fats, we have proteins. So let's talk a bit more about these macronutrients, and let's start with carbohydrates that are composed by carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and the ratio of atoms of hydrogen to oxygen is 2:1. And they can be broken down into two categories. On the one hand, we have digestible carbohydrates that can be broken down by our organisms, and it includes things such as sugars and certain starches. And on the other hand, we have indigestible carbohydrates, including resistant starch and fiber, and instead of being broken down by us as humans, it travels all the way down to the colon, where different microorganisms can ferment it. Carbohydrates are quite rich in fruit and vegetables, and this type of nutrient has been linked to a higher concentration of Bacteroides and Actinobacteria and Prevotella amongst them, and a lower concentration of Firmicutes. Fats are similar to carbohydrates in as much as they are also made by carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, the ratio of these elements on the molecules of fats are going to be different. Fats can also be classified in different subgroups, including saturated fats that they don't have chemical double bonds or unsaturated fats that have these double bonds. And one of the things that made fats very distinguishable is that they are insoluble. So if things are insoluble, they are very hard for our bodies to be able to interact with them. So our bodies have the capability to produce certain substances, such as, for example, bile salts, that are able to make these fats more soluble, and therefore our body able to metabolize them. Uh, Diets that are very rich in unsaturated fats have been linked to a higher concentration of firmicutes and lower concentration of bacteroides. So the opposite of what we saw with carbohydrates. And what about proteins? Proteins are quite different to fats and sugars. First of all, they have extra elements such as nitrogen and sulfur. But also proteins are polymers. They are made from smaller building blocks called amino acids. High protein intakes have been linked to a higher diversity in the microbial community inhabiting the gut, but there are also differences whether this protein is going to come from a plant-based diet, in which we are going to have more organisms able to produce short fatty acids, or a meat-based diet, in which case we're going to see that the community is going to be richer in bile-tolerant anaerobic bacteria. So let's talk about diets now, because diets are made of these macronutrients, and different diets are going to have different concentration of these macronutrients, and they're going to also come from different origins. So for example, Western diets. Western diets tend to be rich in meat, saturated fats, processed grain, and added sugars, and they tend to have lower fiber content. As a consequence, organisms that can use fiber, such as Prevotella, tend to be not as abundant. This kind of diet has been linked to diseases such as cardiovascular disorder, colorectal and breast cancer, coronary heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. One of the products of the metabolism of meats is trimethylamine N-oxide. And this has been linked to disease. And the way that this molecule is produced is we have all this protein in the meat that can be broken down to produce another molecule known as trimethylamine. And then the organisms can oxidize this trimethylamine to produce this TMAO that has been linked to all these health problems. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have vegetarian and vegan diets. They don't consume any kind of meat, so the protein that they are ingesting needs to come from other sources, such as, for example, pulses. This diet has a high input of fresh fruit and vegetables, and this reflects on the microbiome. The microbiome tends to be dominated by fiber degraders that are going to be producing these short-chain fatty acids, and it's going to be very rich in these microorganisms that we have highlighted as a key player, which is Prevotella. Being a Spanish myself, I cannot help myself, and I need to also talk about the Mediterranean diet. The Mediterranean diet kind of sits between Western diet, vegetarian diet. We have very high consumption of fresh fruit, of vegetables, legumes, whole grain, and the main source of our fat is going to be olive oil. We also consume moderate amounts of fish, poultry, and even some wine. And this reflects on the microbiome. The microbiome tends to show a high abundance of Prevotella and very low concentrations on this trimethylamine N-oxide that I mentioned on the Western diet. But there are other more exotic diets, if you may. So for example, we have ketogenic diets that are designed to lose weight. And this seems to be quite counterintuitive because ketogenic diet is characterized by the consumption of high fat content, moderate protein intake, and low carbohydrate. So how does this work? Well, what happens is our mitochondria have the ability to break down fat. but they tend to prefer sugars. Sugars and carbohydrates are a more immediate type of energy source. If we are not consuming this, then the mitochondria will have to resort to fat burning. And the fat burning will result in the production of a molecule called acetyl coenzyme A, that its key is where basically consumption of sugar and fats convene in order to produce energy. So a ketogenic diet is characterized because it's very rich in meats, poultry, fish, shellfish, eggs, cheesecake, green leafy vegetables, oils and fats. And as a result, what we tend to see is something similar to what we see on the Western diets, is a high abundance of bacteroidetes and a low concentration of firmicutes. So we can see how different macronutrients and how different diets can modulate and shape the microbial community inhabiting our bodies. But my take-home messages from this video is, first of all, remember that the main players in the gut microbiome to a phylum level tends to be firmicutes and bacteroidetes, and to a genus level, Prevotella seems to be also a very important microorganism. Micronutrients shape the microbial diversity, and finally, diets have an impact in health through affecting the gut microbiome. And that's it from me. My name is Dr. Mario Torres Rodrigo, and I am the applications leader here at H.E.L. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, please come talk to us. Thank you very much.